Hey, everybody, welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. Is the United States about ready to get itself sucked into a war? Is it trying to get itself sucked into many wars? Do we need to fight any wars for our national security? I mean, I think that's really the bigger question here is not should we fight one, is do we need to fight one? I think the answer is going to be self-evident, but we're going to unpack that today with show favorite and my good friend Douglas Macgregor, former combat leader, highly decorated veteran, and currently CEO of Our Country, Our Choice. Doug, welcome back to the show.
Sure, nice to be here.
And man, we have a lot of mess to talk about here. We were going to talk about some of the stuff about the Russia-Ukraine war and the potential for that. And we're actually going to get to that in a second because, as you mentioned just before we went on air, a lot of this stuff is really connected. But what's really at stake right now, what's really trending and hot, is that 3 American soldiers have been pointlessly killed because of a deployment in the Middle East, just around the Syrian border and in Jordan, which we've been warning about was coming for a long time. And the predictable response for many of the gung-ho war firsters in this country is, yeah, let's go do some more. Let's hit Iran because Iran's behind all this. And so let's just smack them. And former National Security Advisor John Bolton went on, I believe it was earlier today, or maybe it was yesterday afternoon, saying this.
If there were ever a moment, and frankly, the moment started about 3 months ago, but if there were ever a moment now when to show American determination and take a significant step to reestablish deterrence, the president's response has to be to strike targets in Iran.
And then he went on to say, well, they asked him what kind of targets you're talking about, and he actually added some things.
To be clear, I don't think it should be proportionate. I think it should be disproportionate. That's how you create deterrence in the mind of your adversary, that the cost to them of attacking our forces is so high they won't do it again. But to give a couple of specific targets, there are Iranian naval vessels in the Red Sea assisting the Houthis in Yemen. I'd put them at the bottom of the Red Sea. There are Quds Force bases in western Iran that are used for training and equipping these Iraqi Shia militia groups. They could be attacked. There are many, many air defense locations throughout Iran. Any or all of them could be targets. None of this threatens the regime in Tehran, but it sends a very clear message.
I love the way he adds that. It sends a very clear message, but this is not going to war. So he wants his cake and eat it too. He wants to go and hit Iran in all these ways, sinking their ships, all of which are direct acts of war. He just doesn't want to have a war. What do you think about when you hear these kinds of comments?
I think it's important to note a couple of things before we even touch on Bolton. First of all, the United States right now does not have any foreign policy. Our foreign policy is what Israel dictates. So we are essentially, at this point in time, an instrument of Israeli foreign policy. When Bolton was in the White House, it equated to essentially putting Netanyahu on the National Security Council staff. Whatever Bolton said was what Mr. Netanyahu wanted him to say. And that's where we are. And the ultimate goal now for many years, you and I remember this when we were on active duty, there was a concerted effort repeatedly year after year after year on the Hill to essentially bring on a war with Iran. And, you know, the argument was, well, Iran is evil incarnate, it's responsible for everything. Well, that was never true, and it's not true right now. What unites all of the Arabs in the region, and remember, the Shiite militias that he's referring to are Arabs. In Yemen, the Houthis are Arabs. Hezbollah consists of Arabs. All of these Arab entities that are armed to the teeth are angry because what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. And we are seen as supporting it. And we are. We're essentially supporting, you know, a campaign of expulsion and murder in Gaza to drive the entire population out or kill it. And that's where we are. Whether Americans like it or not, that's what we're doing. And frankly, most Americans, as you know, aren't paying much attention. The danger now is that we are finally going to cross this line where on one side, you always had effectively weak opponents, people with no armies, no air forces, very few air defenses, no navies. We're going to cross that line into regional war, which involves real armed forces, real nation states like Iran. And Iran's not the only one. But if you strike Iran, then you bring on this regional war, which apparently is really what people want. Now, the notion that you can sink another country's naval combatants, that you can strike its forces and kill its people without compunction and without consequences is, of course, insane. This man has never been balanced. He is an instrument of Israeli foreign policy. Remember, this is the man who is named a hero of Israel or something and given $1 million for his efforts. So just turn him off because you're just listening to Mr. Netanyahu. The problem is that Mr. Netanyahu controls everything. You know, the Capitol Hill is under control because of the Israeli lobby. We have no policy. Our policy is to do whatever they want us to do. So everybody who's talking right now, whether it's Bolton or Lindsey Graham or any number of foolish people say, oh, we've got to strike Iran. They don't understand that the distribution of power in the world has changed. They're no longer dealing with weak opponents that have no recourse but to sit under the bombings and take it. If we do these things that they want us to do, we will be involved in a very large regional war that stands an excellent chance, as I've been saying for months, of destroying Israel. You know, I'm somebody that thinks Israel deserves to exist. I've always supported Israel. But I've told my Israeli friends, this is not going to work. What you're doing will produce nothing good for Israel. And this government in Israel is absolutely committed to regional dominance by Israel. And we're supposed to underwrite and support this hegemony. And the assumption is that if they can't dominate the region, they have no security. It reminds me of Napoleon Bonaparte, who kept invading country after country after country after country, finally ends up in Russia, where he's not necessarily defeated by the Russians, but by the winter and the distance and the logistics, and he loses everything. And I think that's where we're headed right now with the Israelis. They want absolute dominance. They will accept nothing less because they see that as equating to their security. And we are supposed to make this happen because they know they can't do it on their own. So again, as we've talked before, what's the next step? Next step is attack Hezbollah. Try to make it look like Hezbollah brought it on. And we go from there. And meantime, the West Bank erupts. The Gaza war is not over. They may have killed tens of thousands of people and driven hundreds of thousands out. It's not over. And Egypt is sitting there on tenterhooks. Nobody around Israel wants a war. Jordan doesn't want it. Egypt doesn't want it. Lebanon doesn't want it. Certainly Assad, who is barely clinging to life, who's been targeted for destruction by Israel and as a result us for years, doesn't want it, even though the alternative to Assad was always Islamism. The most dangerous,
could have gotten a lot worse.
Radical Islam, Sunni Islamism. So,
but now, unfortunately, it doesn't end there. I'm going to play one more tip from retired General Kellogg, who was on Fox yesterday, who also was asked on the same question, and he had a different target set in mind in addition to what Bolton said. See if you can pick out the really alarming statement he makes here. Go ahead, Gary.
They have to do what I would call super escalate. They have to take it to a level that everybody's uncomfortable, including those in the Situation Room, where you go to a level you say, okay, this isn't a gamble. It's a risk, and we understand the risks involved. But until we make a clear message and we send a clear message, these are going to continue. So you have to go outside of your normal box, and you have to break the escalation ladder. Either attack the Quds Force leaders, that's Ismail Ghani, or the Supreme Leader Khamenei, or the facilities they've got in Iran, but somebody has to make a hard call, because now we've reached a point where we're going to have to do something very hard, very strong, and the response is going to be probably, from their end, it could be proportionate. So be prepared for that.
Be prepared. You're talking about taking out the leader of a country, the pinnacle of an active war, and you say they might do something back, and we got to be ready for that. I mean, the problem with this, well, one of many problems with this is that no one wants to think about what next after the first strike. What if they don't back down? What if they do come out like you suggest, and they're going to defend themselves and actually get into a war? Then what do we do? No one thinks about what next. How does this help America?
Well, what next is the regional war that right now Mr. Netanyahu and his government want. They want that because they're losing. They've made a mess of Gaza. Their country is at high risk of destruction. And so their answer to everything is escalate. If you escalate, you inevitably pull in your vassal state, the United States, and the U.S. armed forces will do your bidding. That's where we are. So the Israelis are not difficult to figure out. I understand completely what they're doing and why. The larger problem is for the United States. What are we doing? Well, we have been bullying, sanctioning, and bombing everyone who doesn't agree with us for years. Easily for 30 years. We bombed our way through the Balkans. We certainly waged war in Somalia before we went to the Balkans. That didn't work. What we created in the Balkans is an unsustainable status quo, first in Bosnia-Herzegovina and secondly in Kosovo. Then we moved on to the Middle East. We've created a disaster in Afghanistan. We created another one in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya. So what's the answer? The answer is always the same. Escalate, bomb some more. This won't work. It hasn't worked. It's not going to work. But anyone who stands up and says, no, this is not intelligent, this is not the answer, and admits that much of what we're experiencing right now is a function of two things. First of all, the damage we did during this ridiculous global war on terror that simply made millions and millions of new enemies and destroyed countries and societies and millions of lives. And the second part of it is that we're absolutely unconditionally supporting the campaign of expulsion and killing in Gaza. And all of the Arab states have come online, and all the Arab militias and Arab forces that exist in the region are online opposed to it. And so they're attacking us and anybody else who is opposed to it.
Now, I want to ask you.
It's not neurosurgery to figure out, stop what's happening in Gaza. And most of this will stop right now. But in the meantime, as Trump tried, we need to get out of the region. We don't need to be in Syria. We don't need to be in Iraq or any of these other places.
Now, I want to ask you on that point there. You said just a second ago, you see what Netanyahu's doing, you understand why, but also something you said at the top of the show here. I wonder if you can address a contradiction between that, because it's like one thing that Netanyahu wants to do, but then the reality is, as I understand it, there's really no chance that he can accomplish the peaceful security arrangement that he wants, the safety for his people by the course of action that he's pursuing, that he wants us to support. It seems to me those are absolutely contradictory, and he'll make it less secure, not more secure. How do you see that part playing out no matter what we do?
Well, you need to distinguish lies from truth. All you're getting from his side is one lie after the next. First of all, the whole campaign from the outset had remarkably little to do, I would argue, with the hostages taken on 7 October. And as we've seen recently, much of what happened on the 7th of October ends up being debunked. In other words, these allegations of mass rape and mass murder and so forth. So that's part of the problem, but nobody pays attention to that. Remember, journalists always write, for better or worse, the first draft of history. That first draft said all sorts of terrible things. Therefore, it stands, even though it may not be true. And what we're finding out is a lot of it isn't.
Right.
His real purpose and what the Israeli people want, and I know this for a fact, and I understand why they feel this way, is the complete removal of all the Arabs from the Western Bank. In other words, everyone who is north of the Jordan River who is not a Jew needs to go away. Well, they almost accomplished that back in 1948, 49, 50. Doing it now is an impossibility. The world is watching it. The world will not tolerate it. Now, we are not really watching it, but then again, have to keep in mind who controls finance, who controls the media, who controls what we hear and what we don't hear. If you don't go on to alternative media, if people don't turn on these podcasts, all they're going to get is the sort of nonsense you heard from Kellogg. Now, Kellogg, of course, is also advocating that we break our own laws, which I guess is par for the course. And what that means is that you are assassinating the leaders and members of other people's governments. By the way, Soleimani was a member of the Iranian government. When we assassinated him, we broke our laws. Now, I don't care how much you like or dislike any of these people, but under our law, we are prohibited from killing the leadership of other governments. And what people here do not understand, the American people don't understand, is that what goes around comes around.
Right.
We are not going to escape damage as a result of what we're doing, and especially if we go into a regional war. We will not sit here untouched. Enormous damage will come our way. I guess that's the only way to awaken the American people to the reality that we cannot act with impunity anymore. Again, the distribution of power has changed, and no one talks about all of the actors, not just in the region, but external to it, that can become involved against us.
Yeah. And I think, Doug, I think that's one of the, you also said this kind of at the outset. I think that that's one of the big problems that we have at the government level, is that we have gotten away with it all this time. I mean, going all the way back to the Kosovo bombing and, the Somalia, the Libya, ad infinitum. You just keep mentioning them all in there, Iraq, Syria. We were able to do all these bombings, and they couldn't do anything in response because they didn't have any ability to do so. We're getting now already are in this situation now where some of these actors do have the capacity. And and I want you to talk about this a little bit, because you've mentioned this to me in some private conversations. You say that Iran is not this, weak version that a lot of people think that they'll just cow down if they get hit with some missiles. You say they have more capacity than many in the West recognize.
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about that. If you look at their current arsenal of missiles, and the Israelis have been saying these things for years, and they're correct, but they're ignoring them on the assumption that we are somehow or another going to magically remove all of this. They're theater ballistic missiles, they're tactical ballistic missiles, and we have not been exposed to a fraction of that capability, carry 1,000 and 2,000 pound warheads. They have enough missiles to overwhelm the air and missile defenses that the Israelis have. And for that matter, they can overwhelm ours, as we've already seen. And these missiles can fall like rain on Israel's major cities. The Israelis say, well, that's fine, then we'll use a nuclear weapon against them. I don't think Israel would survive the use of a nuclear weapon against anyone. I think all hell would be turned loose against Israel. It's already hurt itself badly in the international environment by its actions in Gaza. That would finish Israel. So I just, if you want Israel to survive, I certainly do, then we ought to stop underwriting these disastrous policies. But we've got to have our own strategy. We have none. Our strategy is to do whatever Israel wants us to do. That's not a strategy. That's the path to destruction for the United States and Israel.
Now, speaking of path to destruction, in the remainder of the time we have here, I want to slightly shift gears because, as you suggest, a lot of these things are all tied together, and you have to view things in global context. And it's not enough that we seem to be wanting to suck ourselves into a war here. We also are continuing to dance around the corner in Europe with the Russia issue. And it's as you and I have talked many times, that there is no military path to victory for the Ukraine side. The most rational humanitarian thing we could do for Kiev would be to try to help them find a negotiated settlement to end that war and get it done with as soon as possible. Instead, we seem to be wanting to go more. So there has been some reports here of late that I think it's come from Sweden, it's come from NATO itself, and recently from the British Minister of Defense, that we are getting ready, and we're in the pre-war, they call it, state right now. We have to get ready because war with Russia is coming. And so now then we have this, I believe it's called Steadfast Defender going on right now. We have this clip from one of our admirals in the area, and here's what he has to say about what's at stake.
Exercise Steadfast Defender is the largest NATO exercise in decades, with 90,000 personnel taking part from all 31 allied nations and Sweden. In this moment, where we face the most dangerous and unpredictable security environment, Steadfast Defender sends a clear message. NATO is capable, modern, and if required, we are ready to defend every inch of Allied territory.
I'm honestly so tired of hearing that clear message nonsense that we keep saying. But you see, they said it. Both Bolton and Kellogg said it. Now here, this guy's saying there. Everybody wants to always talk about a clear message, but the message on the other side, I think, is very different. Because I wonder if you can just talk for a second. What this message that Putin receives when he sees NATO doing this stuff and having this large operation, what is that likely to cause on his side? Is it going to cause him to back down? Is it going to cause him to say, well, I better not go into NATO? Or might it have a different action?
Well, keep in mind that we have failed miserably in Ukraine. We can't even win the so-called proxy war. You have 500,000 Ukrainian dead, and that number continues to climb. Probably 500,000 or more casualties. What number of those are so severely wounded that they'll never return to normal lives? I don't know, but they don't have the right medical support structure. The truth is that Zelensky and his backers in London and Washington could care less about the Ukrainian people. Remember, Zelensky was this Russian speaker who was not even Ukrainian, who was dragged into all of this and then had to take a speed course in Ukrainian to come up and speak publicly. And he still doesn't speak it entirely properly, according to the Ukrainians that I know. I mean, the whole thing is a facade. Then you have this thing called NATO, which is frankly on life support. A big component of this exercise that you just mentioned involves the Turkish and French fleets. You know, the interesting part about Turkish and French naval power is that the Turks and the French hate each other. This isn't going to change anything. And again, we've been bribing the Turks to stay out of the Israeli conflict. I don't think it's going to work. Eventually, they're going to come in, but we just bribed them by saying, you know, let Sweden and join finally, and we'll go ahead and give you F-16s. And by the way, to keep the Greeks happy, well, we'll give you some F-35s. Why anybody wants an F-35 at this stage that hardly flies at all, it's got such a terrible maintenance and support record, is beyond me. But the bottom line is that you can't bribe your way out of this thing, just as you can't bomb and intimidate. So if you're Putin sitting in Moscow, the first thing you realize is, look, this alliance is a paper tiger. There's no unity of effort. There's no unity of command. There's only the United States pushing vassals, to do something that they otherwise would not do. And they do this by inducing fear. Putin has no wish. And by the way, no one in their right mind would want to occupy Europe. Look at Europe. It's a catastrophe.
Right.
Woke has destroyed everything. Our policies have destroyed their economies. He wants to go over there and manage that mess? No, he's got a healthy country. He has a healthy society. He's got very effective armed forces. He's demonstrated that he can't be bullied. He's demonstrated he can't be conquered. That was his point. He's done that very well. In the meantime, more and more millions of Ukrainians are being killed. We got 3 million Ukrainians in Poland. And the government is talking about, well, we need to embrace them and everything else. The Poles want them out.
Right. They don't want to embrace them anymore.
It's hurting Poland. The whole thing is a disaster. And then when you look at poor Finland and Sweden, there are no Russian armies poised to invade. There are no missiles.
Why would they want to?
But we are moving equipment, and I fear missiles and other things into northern Finland and Sweden along the Arctic Circle with the goal, I guess, of further intimidating and angering Russia. The thing that does worry me, even though Putin has exercised incredible restraint, is that at some point the Russians say, the hell with this. These people don't get it. And then you get a real war for which we are completely unprepared. We don't have the inventories of equipment, of munitions. We don't have trained forces anymore. Yeah. This wokeness has done enormous damage to us. We have forces that really don't want to fight. They're happy to push a button and send a missile somewhere, but beyond that, nobody wants to fight. We have got to get out of this. The only way we can get out of it is to get rid of the people in Washington. And it's not a question of Joe Biden. It's not a question of just one new president. And by the way, all the presidents seem to be hostage to this Israeli policy in the Middle East. They're all signed on for the stupidity, the mass expulsion and murder in Gaza, and doing whatever they have to curry favor with Israel, which is insane. This makes no sense. We have no interest in going to war with anybody right now. We have an interest in closing the border and expelling the illegals, millions of them, somewhere between 20 and 30 million. We have to rebuild our country, restore the rule of law. You don't restore the rule of law by breaking it overseas and killing people that are heads of foreign governments. But, we've always heard about this rule-based order. The rule-based order must prevail. Whose rules? Who are we kidding? The rules-based order is a joke. It is worse than hypocritical. It's criminal. It's nonsensical.
We don't
So
follow it
America
anyway.
got to get organized, and they've got to step up and say, this is what we want. We don't want what we're doing. No one is doing that. There are no one running right now will stand up and say that.
That is the problem. In the last few minutes that we have here, you mentioned Turkey and these F-16s. I want to show you a bit of a report where somebody was talking about a couple of aspects of this. And I want to ask you a question on the backside, because I think that this kind of trails into, again, the absence of a strategy to coordinate anything. Gary, play that clip.
Turkey was actually part of the program to manufacture the F-35s. Components of that plane were being made in Turkey. Then President Recep Tayyip Erdogan decided to buy Russian anti-aircraft missiles, S-400s. America strenuously objected, saying that Turkey's using S-400s would compromise NATO air defenses. America threw Turkey off the F-35 program, cancelled Turkey's purchase of F-35s, and then Turkey applied to buy the F-16.
So it seems contradictory to me. If we said, hey, we made a big issue, I remember that because Turkey was going to buy S-400s from Russia to have the F-35s, that was going to cause, a potential vulnerability that could be exploited at the wrong time. And so we said no F-35s, but now that here's a hell of a lot of F-16s. What's the difference, whether it's F-16 or F-35? If they have the S-400 air defense system, it's still going to be a vulnerability to us, but we seem to not care anymore.
Well, the alliance systems, whether in Europe or anywhere else in the world, including Japan and South Korea and so forth, as well as in the Middle East, the alliance systems, the partnerships that we have strategically are all designed to provide a market for our weapons. That's what they're there for. And our arms industry has just made a killing for decades by selling things to allies. Now, we've got several problems. First of all, our technologies, our equipment, particularly in the air and missile defense business, have not performed well in Ukraine. And this was one of the suspicions that the Turks had, that perhaps they were not getting the best solution for their dollars. Now we're trying to bribe them to get back on board with us and stay out of the war in the Middle East by giving them these F-16s. It's all a stopgap measure. Everything, Dan, is falling apart. Yeah. This is the end of the American overseas empire. And the only way that Americans in Washington with their Israeli friends can find to try and stave off the inevitable, along with our own financial collapse, is to escalate. Every time you ask them, what's the answer to this? Escalate, bomb more, sanction more, bully more. This is coming to an end. As we said at the very beginning, we are reaching the end of this process. We're now going to start confronting real nation states with real armed forces, and they're going to say no. They already are. And meanwhile, in the financial system, Russia now has chairmanship of the BRICS. It came about this January. Russia is leading the charge to peg their currencies, and they're members of BRICS and all who want to join it, and there are about 84 nations interested right now, to gold. Now, no one's paying attention to the financial markets. I saw something yesterday. Somebody finally pointed out the Chinese that have been gradually offloading or selling our U.S. treasuries are now increasingly selling more and more. The bond market is the critical indicator of where we're headed right now. And everyone thinks, well, we just print more money. We've reached that limit. We're not going to be able to do that. So we have Armageddon on the financials in the financial sector. We have an extraordinarily weak economy. We have almost no manufacturing sector. The same thing is now increasingly true in Europe. Just look at Germany. Yeah. So what are we going to do to employ people? How are we going to regain our former prosperity? And what's the true basis for our military power? It's always been economic.
Right.
And we can't recruit for the military. No one wants to serve in it. Now, I say, sure, there are people who will serve in it, but they're mostly coming in right now with the wrong motivations. Yeah. And in many cases, the Congress doesn't care. They don't care whether or not these people are Americans. They're just filling slots. That tells you about the contempt that they feel for the U.S. Armed Forces and the people in it. So I just see nothing good happening We're headed
let
down
me
it.
ask you, because man, I couldn't agree with you more on this, and I think it's self-evident that the trends are going where you say it, really across the board. There's just always this almost unsubstantiated belief that, well, we're Americans, so it won't really happen that bad. But that's running out, because that's the spin that's about to hit to reality. If you could tell President Biden right now what to do, or whoever may win in November, what could we do to check this slide if you were given the ability to have some power?
The first thing you have to do is immediately tell Israel that either they stop their operations in Gaza or we will end our support for them. That's vital and essential. We need to put this to bed quickly. That's the real catalyst for the regional war. The second thing is we need to get those American soldiers and airmen, sailors, Marines, whatever, who are sitting in Iraq and Syria, who are just targets at this point, that haven't even been up against the real capabilities that are arrayed against them, and get them out of there before they're killed pointlessly. And idiots in the United States, and I hate to say idiot, but I can't come up with a better word right now, who think that bombing more will solve something. We got to get them out of there before that's the solution again. Oh, we have to punish Iran. It's, we have no memory for the past. There's no sense of history. We see everything through the lens of the immediate. And we always assume that whatever we do is right. We haven't been right for decades. That's our problem. So you've got to do those things right away. And at the same time, you need to have 40, 50, 60, 70, maybe 80,000 troops on the border. We've got to face the fact that inside our own country, our rule of law has broken down. Just look at these reports that came in over the weekend of the lawlessness and violence in Washington and in Maryland. I mean, why is this happening? There's no rule of law. Who wants to be a policeman? I mean, my goodness, a policeman who tries to do his job is in more trouble than the criminal who's breaking in or murdering.
It's crazy.
So, these things have to stop.
And then the question is going to be, who's going to be able to make that happen? And that's what people like what you do with Our Country, Our Choice, channels like ours, we're bringing the truth. This is what needs to happen. And we are desperately looking for someone with the guts and the intelligence and the wisdom to actually make it turn into policy. And we're going to keep holding people's feet accountable and their feet to the fire on this, and until something happens. Because if it doesn't, Doug, I'm afraid what you've feared is going to come upon us, where it's going to be imposed on us from outside, and then we'll be in a reaction mode, and the cost will be very, very high to do that, to get back to some sense of normalcy. But thank you very much for coming on the show again today, Doug. We always value your insights very highly, and we're going to continue to track this situation as we go forward. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Dan.
And thank you guys for joining us too. We're actually, with the second of Doug's comments there about what needs to get fixed is to get our troops out of Iraq and Syria. We're going to be back at 12:30 today, talking specifically about how to do that. So you'll want to join us for that. Be sure to like and subscribe and to share with your friends, because we remain unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the information that you need, the truth, no matter what anybody else is saying out there, because you deserve to know it. Thanks, and we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.